In the bustling streets of Taiwan, where the smell of incense mixed with the tantalizing aromas of street food, this was the arrival of Chinese New Year. And with that, the whole atmosphere, like it was almost a tangible feeling in the air, a sense of just joy and anticipation at the new year. Among the celebrations, one event kind of stood out though. It was the annual Lantern Festival. All around you, you would see a spectacle of light and colors, and all that kind of culminated into what the New Year's festivities were kind of like. These lanterns, they symbolized people letting go of their past selves and gaining a new sense of self. The lanterns literally was kind of like a personification of them casting off the bad and embracing the new as they would let go of the lanterns, so to speak. They're red to symbolize good fortune. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, it cast a glow over the city skyline. Families gathered near Yongda Road. Their faces were alight with excitement. Lanterns of every shape and hue adorned these streets. Everyone kind of swayed together like a gentle breeze. Among the throng of people celebrating, there was a young boy named Li Wei. His eyes were wide with wonder as he clutched his own tiny little paper lantern. He was so excited. It was a vibrant red orb, which was just adorned with kind of all these intricate gold designs, as much as you could expect from like a 6-year-old, right?
Yeah.
And beside him stood his grandmother, her weathered hands guiding him carefully through the bustling crowd. As darkness descended upon the city, the lanterns were lit one by one. Everything felt warm and inviting. The air was full of laughter and chatter as families wandered from the stalls, sampling delicacies and admiring everyone's lantern displays. And then the night drew to a close. Li Wei and his grandmother went to their home. That night, Li Wei's grandmother drew him close, but her voice was soft. It was filled with terror. In an instant, the holiday spirit they had a few hours ago was gone. And instead, in this street in Taiwan, where Weigun Long, where they lived, it was a high rise building. And in seconds, it collapsed in the magnitude 6.4 earthquake. Li Wei and his grandmother were in the building, which collapsed in seconds. Hi, and welcome to Decomposing Flowers podcast. Everything we say in our podcasts are information we've gathered from testimonies, interviews, documentaries, and trustful sources. Any opinion we say is our own. If we get any information wrong, please let us know in the comments. Today we're going to be discussing Weigun Jilong high rise and the earthquake in Taiwan. I just wanted to give a quick content warning before we get into today's case. We are going to be discussing a traumatic natural event. So if you have any kind of stress or anxiety about natural disasters or injuries to children or people, maybe skip this episode, take a nice bath, get a cup of tea, and we'll see you in the next episode. This is about the collapse of a 17-story complex in Taiwan, which caused 115 deaths. Allegedly, it accounted for 115 of the quake's total 117 fatalities. It was 4 a.m. And I don't know about you, I'm kind of a light sleeper. I wake up at nearly anything. My cat has asthma, so even sometimes her breathing wakes me up. But can you imagine? It's 4 a.m. You're cuddled up in your blankets. You're trying to get some sleep before work or school, and there's no warning. First, the walls give out, then the floors as your beds fell. It was shaking so badly, You can't even get out of your bed to try to save your other family members. You don't even know where your other family members are because the walls are gone. A man was lying on a stretcher, and he made a phone call to the members of his family to let them know that he had survived the earthquake. He was hospitalized immediately, but he escaped the hospital and attempted to re enter the collapsed building to look for his wife and children. He was stopped by the firefighters to wait for his family members as they continued the search. He would never find his wife or children. A part of him wished that he didn't make it out. It was horrible at the scene. There were people screaming from inside. You could hear them screaming, but there was almost no way to get to them. Like the way this building was, it was kind of in a horseshoe shape. There were two towers right beside each other. They were 17 feet. And it was like someone just knocked over a Lego building. Like the walls were so thin, it just inwardly collapsed on each other. So trying to rescue people was almost impossible. A family of 4 was able to make it all together. Their faces were grazed and their clothes were covered in dust. The father, Chen, he remembers they were all shaken awake as the building collapsed. It was pitch black and he was pinned down. People in the building were gasping and screaming for help. But what was really scary was when they stopped screaming, when everything was quiet. And I mean, you could hear the ruckus outside, the rescuers trying to call for people. You'd hear, "Hey, I'm over here. Someone shout if you need some help." But as the minutes, the hours, the days wore on, it became harder and harder for the people inside to breathe. Chen said that he wrapped himself in a blanket and he was able to roll himself towards a flat surface where he was able to see the light flickering through a tiny hole. And slowly but surely, he managed to climb his way out to safety. Chen and his wife and 2 children made it through this tiny little hole. They lived on the 8th floor, but by the time they were able to escape the rubble, they were on what was or would have been the 3rd floor. All he had was his family left. There was no chance that they were going to get anything out from their home. It cost him almost 80,000 US to buy the apartment which he just bought last year. Their whole family heirlooms and everything that they owned was in that building, and there was no way they were going to recover it. Imagine you're trapped in the rubble. The dust is coating your face. You can barely breathe, and all the while you hear cracking. You hear the rocks shifting around you, and you can't help but wonder if the next rock comes loose, are you going to be crushed? Miss Al thought these very thoughts for 40 hours while she was barely hanging on to life. But beside her, all she had to look at was her husband and her son. All she could do was hold their hands in hers and just pray that she made it out alive. But by the time all 3 of them were found, Miss Sal was the only living survivor. But she held their hand through the whole thing. There was another woman, Chen. She and her 3-year-old daughter and husband were all together in their bedroom when the quake happened. The whole building toppled out from under them, and all she could smell, besides the dust, was the smell of gas in the air. It was very possible that she was going to be killed in the explosion if even the slightest butt of a cigarette wasn't completely extinguished. They were all going to go up in flames. If they weren't going to get crushed to death, they were going to be burned alive. is what she thought throughout her entire ordeal. The earthquake did a lot of damage to the whole city, but around them, the earthquake ruptured some water and gas pipelines, so the site was flooded, and the smell of gas permeated the air for days. But this wasn't the first time Miss Chen had dealt with this before. She lived in central Taiwan before moving to Tainan, where it was this was the city where the earthquake happened. She survived the 1999 earthquake, which killed over 2,000 people. Before she moved to Tainan, she got married and had her baby girl, and now she was in another earthquake. They were trapped for 3 hours in their sixth-floor apartment in the 18-story building. Taiwan gets a lot of these earthquakes because it's in the Ring of Fire. Now, the Ring of Fire is a area in the Pacific Ocean where the plates tend to shift a lot, which causes a lot of earthquakes, and it also makes a lot of volcanoes, and it's just generally kind of a dangerous place to live. So Taiwan is very used to these earthquakes and tremors. Obviously, this was much more significant than the island has seen in quite a while, but there was no reason why this tragedy even needed to happen, which we'll get to in a moment. So many families were affected by this tragedy. One woman had, in some sense of luck, not that I'm saying this event is lucky at all, she was able to climb under a space created by a baby crib and a closet door so that she wouldn't be crushed and air was able to get in. But this wasn't her baby crib or her closet door. This was just because the floor gave out underneath her and she was able to somehow land in this space. Later, when she was rescued, all she had was a leg injury, but she couldn't stop shaking. She was so afraid. Whose baby was she taking the place of? Was the baby able to get out okay? As the hours turned into days, rescuers tried their best to go from apartment to apartment, drawing red circles on each of the windows that they had already searched. They went from what would have been the top floors to the middle part to, again, the top part. It was just a mess. It was even messier what they would have found inside. One rescuer remembers that he found 5 people. One who was still sleeping in bed, or at least that's how he looked like he was. He never made it out, the man who was in the bed. He was already dead by the time the rescuers had found him. It was like someone was taking pictures of each moment when the earthquake happened. Some people were still in the shower, some people were still in bed. It was horrifying. What was even more scary was the trauma that some of the rescuers had to face. No one wakes up ready to see a body or have to go through an ordeal like this. But it was even more horrifying to be someone who had gone through this kind of ordeal and willingly climbed back into the building just to try to find their family. A rescuer unfortunately came across a 10-day-old girl who was dead in her father's arms. She was rushed to hospital, but she wasn't able to make it. And he, the rescuer, still lives with the trauma today. After knocking down part of the south part of the building, the rescuers could still hear people inside, albeit they got a little bit quieter with time. But It was getting increasingly hard to hear those people inside with the amount of family members and survivors who were standing on this side, pleading with rescuers to try to save their family members who were still trapped in the wreckage. The rescuers kept going and going and going. They wouldn't stop. They wouldn't stop to sleep. Some of them wouldn't even stop to eat, much less use the washroom. They would just keep going. And it was so dangerous in this building. Like, one wrong step, and the whole place was going to collapse again. You never knew where that step was going to be. It was like you were walking on a land minefield the whole time. Some of the video of the rescue was a little bit scary. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Titanic, like the James Cameron movie, where the boat is tipping over and there's parts where they have to grab on to chairs or handrails, or they're walking on the walls, trying to make it out. That's exactly how these rescuers were,
Ugh.
but they could have died at any given moment. The building had 96 apartments and 256 registered residents. Although, due to the timing of the earthquake, many more people were inside when it collapsed. You'd hear ding as some of the residents were luckily close to their cell phones when the earthquake happened, and they were able to pick up signals. So sometimes you would just hear them playing music or trying to call their loved ones, trying to let them know it's okay. I'm going to make it out of here. The rescuers are really, really close. I can hear them now. But for some people, they were just lying. They wanted to tell their loved ones to smile one more time. They didn't want their last phone call to be full of tears. They just wanted to leave them with one last happy memory. All the while, the rescuers, while wearing their huge red and yellow overalls, were able to pull out over 240 survivors from the ruins. As they were going along, they inserted huge supports under slabs of leaning concrete as they searched for more and more survivors. They tried their best, but rescuers could only do so much with their bare hands. The reason why they were just using their bare hands is if they used heavy machinery to reach the people who were trapped, they could have ended up setting off those bombs that they were trying to avoid. One wrong move, and the whole rest of the building, or what was a building, was going to be completely flattened, along with any people inside. So, what they did was they tried to use anything they could to try to detect signs of life. They used sensors, cameras. Some sources even say that they used animals, rescue animals, to try to find them. But after days, eventually, they started using the machinery to try to pull the bodies out. But it was hard work trying to get all these people out with their hands. One 20-year-old man, he was going to school to be a film critic. He was such a cinephile, he called himself. He loved watching horror films. Like, it was everything he watched since he was a kid. Honestly, his friends always joke with him, "Oh my gosh, you're such a psychopath. Your favorite movie is The Grudge? You've got to be kidding me." But this was a real horror movie. He was slowly getting crushed as the debris and rubble pressed on his ribs. Every breath he took made it harder and harder to breathe. It's kind of like if you've ever been in a doggy pile, which is when a bunch of people jump on top of you, and the stack can get pretty high and pretty heavy. But every time you draw breath, it means your ribs can't expand out the same way that they just were. And this was exactly what was happening to this man, except for there was no easy way to get out of this pile. There was no shouting, "Oh my gosh, just get off of me," or "Okay, I'm done." He was stuck, but luckily, emergency workers knew exactly where he was. The hard part, though, was he was in such a tough spot. Like, there were piles upon piles of concrete on top of him, and they had no way to get him out using chainsaws or jackhammers or anything that would make this work easy. The rescuers had to do it by hand, almost like excavating a fossil. Every move was careful and calculated. On the eighth hour, the man could feel himself slipping. He wasn't quite sure if he was going to make it. That was when a hand reached in and touched him on the shoulder, and he was saved. But a lot of relatives were staying close by. Not everyone would have their family members return. Chen Yu said her 3-month-old son was still trapped inside with her sister's family of 7.
Mhm.
That's 8 people. 8 people in a tiny apartment doesn't feel, that small. You can easily go outside, go to the playground, take a break, whatever. But imagine a family of 8 being trapped underneath rubble where one man could barely breathe. Try and imagine 8 people trying to breathe the same air. The air runs out really quickly. Something we all need to survive can go really, really fast. Chen Yu said to the rescuers, "He's just a small child. He he gets sick really easy. I need him to come home." Her voice was cracking. Her eyes were red from crying. Another woman was beside her, and she tried her best to comfort Chen Yu. "It's okay. He's gonna make it out. Your whole family's gonna make it out. They're strong, right? That's why there's so many of them. You guys are undefeatable. You'll make it out." The woman who was comforting her, her son had just been found dead, but she was
Oh,
holding out hope for everyone. She was also hoping her daughter in law and her 2 grandchildren, who were still trapped inside, were going to be able to make it out. There were so many people full of hope. They were just all waiting there to see if they came out safe. They made a kind of camp around the area. It was kind of interesting, actually. There would be generations of relatives just camping outside of the wreckage, waiting to see if their loved ones would be able to come out. It was so personal for so many of them because not everyone sleeps with their phone right beside them, like within their hand, right? Because that's
mm,
how long they had to react to this situation. Or, you know, if you're in a situation like this where you hear an earthquake going on and the walls give out, your first thought is going to be, "I need to get out," or "I need to save my loved ones, my kids," right? You're not
mhm.
going to think about grabbing your phone. It was like this for so many people, just waiting and waiting and hoping that somehow they would be able to make it out. Lots of people would just kind of wander around the wreckage, trying to pick up rock by rock and move it away from the site. There was one man who was clutching his wife's hand and coughing as they went through rock by rock, as the debris wafted throughout the air. But they refused to give up hope. This is really hard because a lot of the people who were in the building were also students who attended the nearby Kongshang University. Lee, who was waiting outside of the wreckage, was waiting to hear if her 20-year-old nephew made it out alive. She said, "We will keep waiting. We can't give up hope. We won't let our hearts go. We never thought something this terrible could happen in our beloved city of Tainan and the main city. Like, what are the chances something like this would happen?" A man would come up and sympathize with her. It was suspiciously cheap, you know?
Mm-hmm.
His name was Huang. He introduced himself. A man standing next to him nodded his head in agreement. He too was also waiting on the news of relatives trapped inside. Huang Sung had escaped the collapse, but his daughter in law was still in the hospital in serious conditions. His 1 and 12-year-old grandsons, who had been sleeping on the ninth floor, had still not been found, but they all talked about why the building collapsed. All around them, there were 2-story buildings, there were 16-story buildings, all of them pretty much untouched. There had been some fallen tiles or a couple of cracks, but not a whole building that collapsed. This building had been there for almost 20 years. Why would it have suddenly have collapsed? Another mother came up. She was a mother of a family of 8, and they were still trapped inside the building. Chen was her name, and she knew the residents had complained about the problems inside their home because she was one of them. There were cracks in the walls, and tiles fell off after several earthquakes in the recent years. But the basement always seemed to leak when it rained, and the elevators were rarely working. So she always had to bring up groceries for her family of 8. And it was hard. She was the only one trying to provide for her family. Every part of her ached, but nothing ached as hard as her heart, thinking about all her kids inside. She always wanted to move out of that building, but they would never be able to afford it. I mean, how could they? This was relatively cheap, and no one would really lend to them. There were other condos on the market, but locals knew not to buy these condos. Even a local bank wouldn't issue mortgages to people who wanted to buy these condos. They didn't want to grant loans to what they felt was a shoddily made building. Q, who bought an apartment in a complex after securing a loan from a different bank, was in intensive care with a cracked skull, and her husband was at a different ICU with damaged lungs. Their 7-year-old died in the collapse. She remembers sympathizing with a survivor next to her in the hospital bed. You know, people from outside this town, people like them, they didn't have any idea what was going on before they moved in. They hadn't heard about the problems with the building or the bank's qualms about it until after they had already moved in, after they'd already worked so hard for their mortgage, after they already spent their entire down payment, which depleted their savings. They didn't know that the building was completed by the second developer after the first one went bust. They only found out after they signed their contract. Locals knew that the builder didn't have a good reputation. It was all outsiders who bought there, which was interesting because that many people knew about the poor design of the building, but no one questioned it. If so many people knew about the poor design, why didn't anyone stabilize the structure or fix the issues or, warn people? What would have happened if I just bought in a safer part of town? And, maybe it would be more expensive, but, my loved ones would still be alive. Li Shan, she was tapping her husband's back, kind of like when your loved one's sick and you want them to feel better. You'll tap them on the back or, you know, rub in soft circles, try your best to comfort them. Except he wasn't moving. She held her son in her arms too. She sang to the both of them, trying to comfort both of them. All the while, she struggled to breathe. Eventually, she was rescued. Her husband died trying to protect her from the brunt of the collapse, and their infant son also died in her arms before she was able to be rescued. As she was being carried out, there was a pair of grandparents who hadn't heard any news about their loved ones, but as they saw her being carried out and they realized that wasn't their daughter, she heard them scream does that mean we just have to wait here for the bodies? And, you know, a lot of them wanted to act. They wanted to dive right in, but it was so dangerous. They wouldn't be able to. Just absolutely devastating. There was this tapping noise. You'd hear tap, 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 and it would go quiet for a little bit. And then you'd hear tap, 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 or sometimes you'd hear it go tap, 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 tap. Ming was trying to comfort himself. He lived
Mm-hmm.
on the sixth floor of the complex. He was 48 years old. He had just gotten out of a difficult relationship and he was looking to restart life. But as he struggled to breathe, all he could do was tap. And this was because he was stuck underneath a wardrobe. His legs were broken. He had no way of trying to get out. He didn't even know if his legs were still attached. It hurt that bad. And after hours of knocking and tapping, he heard a crash, a horrible bang. And he was absolutely sure in the next few seconds he was about to be crushed to death. But that was when he heard the cries of the rescuers. We're here. Hello. He
Wow.
frantically tapped. He banged with all his might on the wardrobe, and finally he could see the light of day as he was rescued. Another man was fighting for not only his life, but for his girlfriend's life. He had been propping himself against the wall for 20 hours to avoid smothering his girlfriend, Cho, who was right behind him. But his strength was draining away. He knew as his arms shaked, if he let go, just to take a breath, just to take a breather, he hadn't slept. He'd barely even gotten to sleep that night. If he just took a break, he'd feel so much better. The screaming in his arms would finally stop, but that meant his girlfriend's life would also stop. There'd be no way. If he let go of this wall, there was no way he was going to be able to come back up. The young couple had been trapped in their complex in kind of the kitchen area. One wall had collapsed on top of them, and it was taking all of Ching's strength to try to keep them both alive. Behind him, Cho said to him, "It's okay. You can let go." He didn't want to accept the truth. He'd kind of already given up. He knew he didn't have any more strength left. He didn't have any more adrenaline to keep on pushing himself. But Cho was behind him saying, "It's okay. It's okay. You can take a rest now. It's okay." But he just wouldn't give up. All the rescuers heard was, "It's okay."
Mm.
And the pair were pulled from the rubble. It was so hard because his mother was one of the ones who was camping outside, waiting on bated breath to see if her son would make it out alive. When she saw Cho, she thought that was all there was going to be. And she went to the ground crying. But a couple seconds later, her son followed immediately after, and she felt so thankful. And then she realized so many other people were going to have a moment like she just had, but they wouldn't end up being thankful. The last survivors were a woman and her niece. And you know the rule of threes for survival? Like humans can survive 3 days without water,
Mm-hmm.
3 weeks without food, so on and so forth, right? Well, this woman and her niece were found 60 hours after the earthquake. They seemed to be, at least, teetering on the edge of death. Really, there was only 12 more hours left before they should have been dead
Mm.
by all kind of calculations go, right?
Yeah.
Like we can only survive 72 hours without water. But this 8-year-old, Lin, who was rescued with her 28-year-old aunt, May, was able to survive. And Lin was fully conscious. Her rescuers remember her saying, "Excuse me, do you have anything to eat? I really want to eat some gelatin, some
Oh, wow.
jello, or ice cream, or can we go to McDonald's? I really just want a burger. Like, she was just so hungry.
Oh,
She was covered in dust and she smelled pretty bad, she felt. Really embarrassed about this. She
oh,
was weary and thirsty. She was dehydrated and she was actually a little hypothermic, but she was awake and she was okay. There wasn't a scratch on her. They were both rushed to hospital, but they would make a full recovery. The Ministry of Defense dispatched army units. There was 108 personnel, 11 medical teams, 24 search and rescue teams, and 38 vehicles who were trying to save everyone who could have been injured or stuck in the hours after the earthquake. At the Air Force, they made kind of this makeshift rescue center, a total of 1,000 or yeah, 1,200 beds were in 4 locations for people who had lost their homes due to the earthquake. A lot of those people were from this apartment complex. In fact, most, if not all of them, were. But on February 13th, 2006, Mayor William Lai declared the search and rescue for earthquake victims over. There would be no more survivors
oh,
after the aunt and her niece were pulled from the rubble. It was one of Taiwan's worst earthquake death tolls since 1996, when the 7.6 magnitude earthquake killed 2,300 people.
wow.
Mm-hmm. But as the rescue workers were sifting through the rubble, there wasn't survivors or the bodies that they found that were the only horrifying things they found. They came across tin cans during the rescue operation. And these tin cans were in the beams of the building itself. So, a large portion of the way this building had been constructed was that some of the beams and the walls were filled with these metal oil tin cans, which were empty, to build up this 17-story building. At the time, this was not necessarily common practice, but it did happen in some smaller buildings. And actually, it wasn't illegal prior to September 1996. But since then, styrofoam and formwork boards have been used instead. Because, as you can imagine, like you're stepping on a Coke can. This thing isn't built to withstand pressure,
Yeah.
especially not the pressure of a 17-story building. And normally buildings don't shake, but this was Taiwan. It was in the ring of fire where so many earthquakes were going to happen and have happened. But this building wasn't built in mind for, the building settling, the building shifting, or the building being in an earthquake, which is why it collapsed like a tin can.
Wow.
This building was one of the 11 that collapsed after the earthquake, but this was the only high rise which completely crumbled. It collapsed on itself. There were broken steel built beams which were smooth and had very, very little concrete attached to them, which just shows that the building's construction was not strong enough to reinforce the steel beams when the earthquake struck, which caused them to snap. In the earthquake in 1996, a lot of inspectors went around to inspect the quality of concrete out of the 1,000 buildings that were damaged or collapsed. And they found that in almost all of them, the quality of the concrete was directly related to the damage. In 88% of those damaged buildings, they all failed to meet regulatory standards and practices that were legal to have a building like that.
Wow.
Um, and there's a lot of things that end up creating this, such as, price competition coupled with poor accountability, which made developers take shortcuts, such as watering down concrete to cut costs and make pouring easier. Because essentially, once a developer constructs a building and sells it, they're cleared of any responsibility, especially if they change their company's name and keep building through a different company's name.
Oh, wow.
The developer, Lin Minghui, went missing after the earthquake, but police found him and arrested him. Two of his associates were also detained. Now, Lin has a history of making these dubious business transactions. He was actually kidnapped
Oh,
by the previous CEO of Weigun Company during a debt dispute in the 90s. The defendants had found that they took shortcuts to save money. They'd altered the beam columns in their building, and civil servants who approved the construction and permits for Weijiang complex in Tainan, a lot of netizens said that they should be able to share the blame alongside the developer for the collapse. When they were looking at the concrete, they found that there was a high presence of polystyrene and it was mixed with the concrete. So, polystyrene, because I didn't know what this was, is a hard and stiff and synthetic resin, which, when mixed with concrete, makes the concrete more brittle and susceptible to damage and collapse. Which, again, in maybe other constructions, like in some place that doesn't have earthquakes, would be okay. Not
mm,
necessarily the best, but it would be okay. But in Taiwan, where earthquakes happen on the regular, this was not okay. But the company had permits for the building's blueprints, which only had to pass two reviews, one for safety and one for aesthetics. And once the work began on site, inspectors and regulators were required to photograph the work performed on each level and evaluate it for compliance with the original plans. But um, the developer is allowed to pour concrete on that level and begin working on the next one. So it is said that the complex was not built to specifications. For example, only using half the number of steel rods for the east side, as the plan indicates. And the use of tin cans was not illegal prior to September of 1996. But since the building was built in 1986, the framework technically was legal, but the outer shell could have been built stronger. The building may have survived the earthquake. So many people could have survived this earthquake. In a city of 2 million people, this was the only major high rise that collapsed. Again, it's just devastating to think.
yeah.
Um, I couldn't find any more information on the sentencing of Mr. Lin and his associates, but since then, actually quite recently, the building has been reconstructed.
Oh,
Yeah, the government allowed for 25 billion for the reconstruction after the damages caused after this earthquake. The government also said that they provided rent assistance and the banks provided interest-free long-term loans for the survivors. They also will, after the whole incident, they released reports on land around Taiwan, on the soil, and how the earth was, because this building was built on what used to be a rice paddy, so the ground was not very good.
oh,
Um, so rebuilding this complex was no small undertaking. In fact, there's actually no profit to be made, they said. And because the ground is so unstable, they constructed a strong foundation, which extended 24 meters into the ground. The first three floors of this building are for a clinic, and then there's 48 residential units above. Lin and Chen, who had lost their two sons in the collapse, brought their young daughter to the ceremony. They said, I have hope for the future. Hopefully, we can move in and start a new life after all this. Although the earthquake caused immeasurable pain, the Taiwanese have transformed their suffering into love and support.
Oh,
They have a couple different associations to rebuild housing for the survivors. Much like the Lantern festivals, they hope that the survivors can bid farewell to their past and move to meet a bright future. But a little update on Taiwan is they had another earthquake, which just happened
oh no.
April 3rd, 2024.
Oh.
Um, yeah,
Oh yeah, I think I heard of that.
yeah, they just had one. It was not in the same area. It's in Hulen, which is another big city in Taiwan, though. It was 7.2 magnitudes, and it also made a lot of earthquakes. But so far, what I've read is there's been about 6 people who have been found dead, um, and they're working around the clock to try to rescue more
Oh,
survivors.
that's good.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that was the one where it said it was like the worst one in 20 years.
yeah. It's really
Yeah.
bad, but thankfully, the people of Taiwan were more prepared
That's good at least.
for this. Yeah, but that was a case of Tainan and the collapse of the 17-story complex. As always, if we got any information wrong, let us know. And we meant no harm, and we just wanted to share the story of um, such a tragic case. But as always, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode.